I wanted to very quickly grab the wrong paper. Let me grab one of those one down here. So I wanted to just go over this with you one more time really quick about the reopening. So not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, we will come back on our Sunday night services, and we'll kind of do the same thing where we were doing our prayer cards. We'll do kind of a review of those on that first Sunday night, get back into that groove, and start moving on from there. Then the following Sunday, July the 12th, we'll have our Sunday schools open back up. And then the following Sunday, which will be July the 19th, we will look about the drive-in service, the 9 a.m. drive-in service coming inside. I think most everybody though here comes to the second service anyway, so that's gonna be an interesting time, because I think we got a good feel last Sunday of what that's gonna look like. Last Sunday there was a few, I think, Kenny, if I'm right, there was a few that typically goes to the 9 a.m. that was here, but not that many. So that's gonna.
We had 42.
We had 42.
Last Sunday morning.
Okay.
Yeah, 42. I think that's the most we've had
inside here. So now, it was Father's Day, it was raining, you can kind of throw your parameters around there as well. So that's just going to be an interesting one. So continue to pray for that. The purpose of that is to continue to let people space out. I mean, that's why we're doing the two, is so that if the people that were at the 9 a.m. Want to come in, we've got that. So that's going to really be an interesting thing. But then August the 2nd, I think we're going to be back full force, pending anything crazy happening. But that's with all the women's and the men's book studies or Bible studies, our discipleship training, our youth, our children, everything should be kind of getting back up to that. Any thoughts or questions about that? I know some churches have gone a little faster, some churches are still a little slower. Any thoughts about that? Any comments or questions?
It'll just be a slow process.
I think it will too.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
It'll just come along in time, I think.
So we need to be patient. Sunday school classes, same way. We've kind of talked about that, making some adjustments for Sunday school classes if we need to, especially the Sunday school classes that are kind of on this side in here. Just seeing what we need to do for that. Okie dokie. Okay, so I think that's everything. This Sunday at 4 o'clock, we're going to have a leadership meeting. And then Marilyn had also sent me a message about National Day of Prayer for our nation. There's the website, calltofall.com. If you wanted to take a look at that, calltofall.com. It talks about praying for the nation and spending 5 minutes. And I think this Sunday we'll take 5 minutes of our service time and pray together for our nation. I think we need it. I think we need it. Okay, so we're going to dive back into this. So again, I was the other night. I was started kind of really working on this and put the finishing touches on it today. And it's not the easiest thing to summarize Genesis, Exodus, and half of Leviticus. But we're going to try. And I guess technically, does the hour start when they come in? Because if that's so, then man, we got to like 8:30. So if that's
You gotta go home with me, remember?
yeah, right. Well, let's start. We're going to start in Genesis now. On the PowerPoint, you're going to see there's going to be some charts that pop up. The charts didn't make it in your notes, but I did run off the charts for you, so they're on the back, just so you can see it. But again, I'm not going to really highlight or hit anything. If you have any questions, we can stop and kind of look at it. But I just want to get you back in the feel of things, the swing of things. just so we can pick back up. Next Wednesday night, we'll pick up at the middle of Leviticus and keep moving forward. I do have a sheet at some point I'm going to hand out, and I did hand a few of these out, I think. But maybe it's to kind of evaluate what you guys want to do after we get done with this. So there's some sheets here, some different ideas, different class ideas on Wednesday nights. I've kind of got our Sunday nights planned out, but if you wanted to try something on Wednesday nights, we could get into that. So again, Genesis is just the word beginnings. It's how it all began. It's to remind Israel of where they started, where they began, the significant events and places and important people of their past. Remember that that Moses really starts putting all this stuff together during the Deuteronomy book time. So as they are wandering in the wilderness for 38 years, he decides that it's important that we start documenting these things, because that generation that had really known about that stuff is going to die. So it's the next generation that's going to come over, and that next generation is needing to know where they started, how they started, the important things that had happened. So the three key ideas in Genesis: God created, and creation was good. Disobedience separated people from God, and God instituted this program of revelation, and it's called a covenant. So he made the covenant with us, and we're the ones that typically break that. And again, there's just some definitions. Covenant is the promise that he makes with us, and we attempt to make back with him. Election, now this is not election as far as what the New Testament Reformed thinkers are of elected individuals. This is election as a group of Israel, his people. It was through Abraham. We see the idea of monotheism, which is just basically one God. This goes against a lot of the worldly things. Multiple gods, or polytheism, so it's just a belief in existence of one God. We get sin comes into this, and origins, the origin of the universe, and which is a really kind of interesting concept with this. But Jesus, we see Jesus in Genesis like crazy. There's just some specific things from Genesis 1 through 3 when we see mankind is made in our image. And we see that the Lord speaks and says that he will strike you on the head, speaking about the serpent, when you nip him at the heel. Abraham was visited by 3 unusual strangers. There's some belief there. Jacob wrestling with God, per se. But we know Jesus himself says in John 8:58, he says, I am even before Abraham. Of course, that got them all, got the Pharisees all riled up when he says this. But before Abraham, I am. And so this is kind of the chart that I wanted to go over with you real quick. And again, these charts are on the back. But just some significant people that are in here that we know of. And again, it's just to kind of get your blood flowing again, thinking about this. But we get Adam and Eve, obviously, are the first. Towards the end of this last semester, I was reading quite a bit about creation and some different things on that, and Adam and Eve, and man, there are so many beliefs out there that just skew all of this. It's just crazy. It really is crazy. But Adam and Eve, obviously, God created Adam, and then from Adam He created Eve. It's just a reminder about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. This is where people that try to debunk or go against the Bible, they'll take Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 because they will say stuff like, well, in Genesis 1, Adam is formed this way. In Genesis 2, Adam is formed this way. Even Pentecostals will believe it a little different. Some people say, well, in Genesis 1, the account is like this. God made this first, then he made this, then he made this. Genesis 2, it looks different. It's reversed. So people that are looking to try to find holes in Scripture, they're going to try to find the holes in Scripture. It's called, and again, we see this, and we kind of talked about this before we stopped. Remember, Moses was taking very important ideas and he was writing them twice. It's in Hebrew, it's called a toledoth. And a toledoth is where you retell the same thing. Because remember, very few people were literate at this time, so they had to hear it. So when this would have been read out loud, they would have heard the account of Adam and Eve twice. So Moses is retelling the story twice. And a lot of people have tried to make this into two separate creation accounts. That God did something on this day, or God did something in chapter 1 that he did something totally different in chapter 2. But that's not the case. He does this again in Leviticus when he talks about the setting up of the tent and the community and things like that. So Adam and Eve, of course, we get Cain and Abel come from this. We see the problem with Cain and Abel. We see Seth being the next son. We also find that that there was a lot going on there between them. Of course, sin entered in chapter 3 with this. We talked about Noah last Sunday and chapter 6 of Genesis. Remember, chapter 5 is a really cool chapter of Genesis. It's one that gets overlooked quite a bit. It's the Adam to Noah. This is where Enoch is mentioned in the Old Testament. But the flood comes into play, and it's a really interesting part of the history of the earth. The first 6 chapters is a very dark and different time. And a lot of people will stretch it and say all the way up to Abraham himself, chapter 12. That world is a different world. And I like to go back to this world and reiterate this point. I was speaking with somebody about it the other day. We were talking about the restoration. And, I just think it's so important that we study Genesis, we learn about Genesis, because I think when all of this is said and done and God sends Christ back and there's going to be the cleansing and the reforming and everything, Revelation is very clear about a city, and the city's going to be inside of the garden. And what's the garden? Well, the garden's going to represent the original garden. And getting this back to this initial phase. And so it's just so neat to read how the first 6 to 12 chapters of Genesis go. But we get Noah and what happens through the flood because of the Nephilim and all the evil stuff that's happening. If you ever get a chance to read it's a short little kind of disclaimer, but it's the 9 levels of angels. Have you ever seen the 9 levels of angels? Now it's a Catholic thing, but it's a really neat explanation. I've actually got a copy of it. And it breaks down the 9 levels of angels in the Bible, and it shows where they're referenced at. And so it shows the top ones that sing stuff like in Revelation, when we see the angels that are singing "Holy, Holy, Holy is the Lord God Almighty," who they sing 24/7. That's a different set of angels than what we see in the rest of the Bible, and the cherubim and all of the different spots. So anyway, it's really cool. If you get a chance to look up the 9 levels of angels. But I say that because that goes back to Noah, and the whole point with Noah, that the evil, that when God had cast a third of the angels down, the angels had come to the earth. And we know that because God sent angels to guard the entrance of the Garden of Eden. So we know that angels have been here. So there was a lot of evil, a lot of sin. So God says, I'm going to wipe that away. So Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Noah decides one night he has a little bit too much to drink. After this is all over with, he is laying naked in his tent. Ham is the first one that finds him, and instead of covering him up, he goes and gets his brothers, and the 2 other brothers then come back. And when Noah awakes, he blesses Shem and he curses Ham. And the interesting part about that, as we talked about, is that Shem is the line of Abraham. So that was where Abraham's line comes from. And Ham is the line of the father of Canaan. So the land of Canaan. So remember, what is the promised land? It's the land of Canaan. And what is the promised land for? The promised land is for the line of Abraham, Abraham's descendants, to do what? To conquer Canaan. So it kind of comes full circle with that. And then Japheth just kind of did his thing. But from there, we get Abraham and Sarah. They come into the picture. Abraham's nephew Lot, Abraham's kind of maid servant, Hagar, and they have the son Ishmael. Again, this is where a lot of thought of the Muslims come from, is Ishmael when they are cast into the desert. He also has the son Isaac. Of course, Isaac will eventually marry with Rebekah. Jacob and Esau. The issue with Jacob and Esau again. Esau gave up his birthright. Jacob swoops in and takes it. And ironically enough, Esau, his descendants, are the Edomites, Edom. And the Edomites, they married women from the land of Canaan. That's kind of a weird tie. So that whole cursed line is just kind of hanging out together on one side. But Jacob and Esau, Jacob marries the Leah and Rachel thing where he marries one, and then 7 years later finally gets Rachel or Leah. And then that's where he has the Joseph and the brothers, and this is the 12 tribes. So it's kind of fast, I know. The places that are in Genesis, obviously nothing. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. So we go back to that question of, well, when is the beginning, and where did God come from? And it's too deep for tonight. He creates the universe, creates the earth. This is the idea of, I don't know if we talked about this or not, this is the idea of heliocentric and geocentric thoughts on the universe. Does the earth really go around the sun, or does the sun go around the earth? Is the earth the center of the universe? Matter of fact, I had an interesting talk about that with somebody who was very much believing that the Bible states that the earth is. But anyway, Garden of Eden, obviously. And then post the garden, we get Sodom and Gomorrah, the mountains of Ararat, and on Ararat itself, that is where Noah's vessel landed. Babylon comes into play. Nineveh is seen here, and we know that Nineveh will come back to play in many accounts in the Bible. Babel, Shechem, Egypt, so some really major places. And then the events, obviously, creation. We talked a lot about the various views of creation, on how old is the earth, how old is the universe, how old is, how did it start, did it start? There's things that's theistic evolution and atheistic evolution, and there's all kinds of stuff. So the fall of man, the Nephilim, the flood, the Tower of Babel. It was a wonderful account of God kind of breaking down that. The rest of that, and again, kind of going back to the angels tie, don't forget in Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels that were on earth had power, and they had power to, they blinded the men that were trying to get into the house. So the angels had some power, and it's a really neat revelation tie. Joseph and his dreams, and the story of Joseph and all of his travels, and then of course that leads to the famine in Egypt. So and that picks us up where Exodus will take off there. So there it is. There's a 10-minute commentary on the book of Genesis. But I figured we took quite a while to go through that one anyway. Any thoughts, questions, comments on Genesis? Bereshit. Bereshit is how they say Genesis in Hebrew. Bereshit. Yeah, so good stuff. Good stuff on Genesis. It's a wonderful book. Like I said, one day when I grow up and get through all this, I want to write a book on Genesis and Revelation together. But that's years and years away. All right, so we get from Genesis to Charlton Heston. Finally, get back to him. We have missed him. I guess it was this past Easter when it was on again. I hadn't watched it in a little while, and I watched it again around Easter. And man, I get tickled when I watch it. I really do. But, honestly, it's probably more biblically close than any of the newer versions of any of this stuff is anyway. So, But the Exodus, the great Exodus, the key word of this one from Genesis, we have beginnings. Now we have salvation. Obviously, Moses is the author of this again. There is some speculation that Moses was not the author of these books, but I do believe that he was. But we get the supremacy of Yahweh, the supremacy of God, because God will flex his muscle to free his people. It's a redemptive event for the Israelites, a Mosaic law, a social character for Israel, and then we see the presence of God being symbolized inside of the tabernacle. So the word Exodus in Greek means to exit. Shemat. Shemat is the Hebrew word for Exodus, and it just means salvation. And so there's really two big concepts that come from this book. That God redeems his people. He redeems them out of bondage. And he chooses Israel. So this is really where he really does favor them. Because up to that point, he was watching over them through Abraham and through the patriarchs. But now, with Moses and the prophets and the lining up of the community and all the stuff that's fixing to happen, he really does put his hand on the Israelites here. And so, the purpose of the book gives us insight to God's nature, provides a foundational theology of who God is, how we are to worship him, about his laws, his covenant with Israel, and his overall plan of redemption. And we see Jesus in this really through, sometimes you'll hear people talk about Jesus as the second Adam. Sometimes people will call him the second Noah, but you hear him a lot be referred to as the second Moses. And as we kind of really started, and as a matter of fact, once we get through this little section of not this Sunday, but next Sunday, when Jesus walks on the water, we're going to get a good tie-in to what this means. But he's called the second Moses because Moses will be the human savior for God's people, and of course Jesus is the ultimate savior for all of mankind. So we see that. But story begins about 430 years. So Joseph was in Egypt. Remember, there was a famine in Egypt, so he goes there. His family comes there, and she saved your seat over here. Joseph goes to Egypt, and because of the famine, remember, he had worked his way up. He was really number 2 in charge of Egypt behind the Pharaoh himself. And he brings with him his family, and Israel starts following. And about 400 roughly years have passed, which again is a really ironic number because so it's about 430 years between this. It takes about 400 to 450 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So 430 years, a boy by the name of Moses is born and comes into the picture to save Israel. He's the human savior. And about 450 years, another boy is born, and his name is Jesus. So again, this is where the tie-in to the second Moses comes into play. It's kind of interesting. But Joseph takes them, and all of a sudden, over a 400-year span, the Israelites have migrated to Egypt. And because of that, the reigning Pharaoh and the people are getting nervous about so many Israelites there. So they decide, instead of trying to work with them, that they're going to enslave them and start that process. So Israel is enslaved, and there's roughly some kind of thought was about 600,000 men over the age of 20. And so if you add that in with the women and the under age of 20 and children and so forth and so on, there's roughly about 3 million Israelites that were enslaved there. So we'll go to our little chart here. So Israel, in our overall kind of study here of Exodus in our chart, We have Israelites, we have the Egyptians now coming to the scene. Remember, during this time, the Egyptian army was the biggest and strongest army in the world at this time. Of course, we have the Pharaoh. And then we have Moses come on the scene, and eventually his wife Miriam. We see Jethro come in, and Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. He has two names. Interesting note about Jethro that I think sometimes we overlook. He was a priest, and he was a Levite priest. He never did follow. He did not follow in the footsteps of the other Israelites. Remember, the Levite priests. Now, this has not been officially made yet. This will happen at the end of Exodus and into Leviticus. But the Levite priests are sent to other spots. So Jethro never went up into Egypt. It's almost as if God had a plan for him to go someplace else. So he was off someplace else. Hence Moses comes into contact. There is actually some people that do believe, and I don't know where I'll stand on this one or not, but that Jethro provides Moses with a lot of information about the history of the Israelites in the book of Genesis. There's a lot of thought that he may have given Moses some insight about the Hebrew nation, because if you think about Moses, he wasn't raised in a Hebrew family. He was raised in the line of the pharaohs and the kings, so he was not taught Hebrew history per se. And so there's you read a lot of scholars that think that actually the time he spent with Jethro really was a time of him learning about the history of the Israelites themselves. So now I would venture to say maybe the divine revelation that would come in from God, maybe Jethro could fill in some gaps, possibly, but I don't know. But anyway, he was a Levite priest. So he was off in that area. We see Aaron come into play, Moses' brother, and the tribe of Levi will be established here. And remember, the tribe of Levi is one of the 12 tribes, but it's a priestly tribe. So this is the tribe in which that God's going to kind of start with. He's going to focus on them. We don't really get a lot of places per se. I mean, you could put the sea, that Moses parts and stuff. But really, we got Egypt and we got Mount Sinai. That's kind of how the story unfolds. Moses will flee Egypt. He ends up in the land of Midian, where Jethro's the priest. Mount Sinai, he goes up on Mount Sinai because he, for some reason, sees a bush that is burning, but it's not really burning. And he goes, investigates, and it talks to him. So he has an intervention with God. They go back to Egypt. He takes Israel back to the base of Mount Sinai. And so the events, obviously, we know a lot of the events in Exodus. The calling of Moses on Mount Sinai. We know the 10 plagues. We've spoken a lot about that. The Passover. Sometimes we kind of forget about the Passover, what it means. So there's the Passover. The 10 Commandments. And not just the 10 Commandments, but the issues upon receiving them. Remember that there was a lot of issues on receiving them. I didn't put this on here, but it's not just the written laws, but it's the oral laws that God provided as well. The presence of God, he starts to show himself more. We see the tent of meeting towards the end of this. So he's going to talk to people more. He's going to talk through the priest. He's going to see the priest, the tabernacle. So God is really going to put himself upon his people. He's really going to be there. The establishment of Israel as a nation comes through this. And they're going to start receiving the setup. So remember, we kind of talked about this, that he has freed them from bondage and from slavery. So now they're all just kind of standing there saying, now what? And he's like, here's what. And he starts to form. Here's the laws. Here's how you're doing it, where you're doing it, why you're doing it, and so forth and so on. But, I want to point something out about this, too, that I think is really important, especially in these times that we're kind of going through now, with the whole restoration of the garden when Christ returns upon his second visit, when the wrath is finally over with and everything's restored. I think that's such an important point that we are promised that God says, I want to be with my people. I kind of alluded to it, I think maybe a little bit on Sunday, with Adam, with Enoch, with Noah. I mean, he walked with these people. And I think what a neat thing that is. And I think we forget that sometimes, that there's going to be a day when all this is restored, in which, just like in Exodus, he wants to come down to his people. And I use this analogy a lot, but it's a true analogy. You know, with Roman and Greek gods and all these secular gods, these people, you can get into Wicca, and you can get into this, the Force and all these things that people worship and study and try to get with. But they're all these non-existent things. And here is the God who created the universe, and he longs to be with us. And there's going to be a day in which, when we are finally presented clean, when we do our great judgment ourselves, and we are now clean, where we can go before him, he wants to come down to us. And I think that's such a neat reminder. That's what I've always liked about Exodus, especially the end. It gets kind of, it can get kind of dry to read at times, where you're thinking, man, it's just about the tent and this and that. But it's an establishment. It's him getting his people ready for his presence. And it's the same way with us, that when all this is said and done, when we are judged, and we finally get judged, and we stand before, it's us now being ready to usher in God in front of us. And I just, what an exciting time it's going to be, and how neat is that? So that's the Exodus. We got through the Exodus. Any questions about the book of Exodus? Shemot. You didn't know you were learning Hebrew tonight, did you? Any thoughts on that? Again, we went kind of fast, but I think we spent quite a bit of time in this one as well. So the book of Exodus. Okay. And we'll kind of get to the last one here, just about the half of Leviticus. And the last one, and we got to about chapter 19 of Leviticus, which is one of my favorite chapters of the entire Bible, and I use it quite a bit. But it's a beautiful book, a beautiful chapter. So Leviticus is all about holiness. So God has created. God has He has created His people. He's created the things. He's created His land. Everything's created in Genesis. In Exodus, He frees them out. He provides a freedom. He provides a prophet. He provides a line of priests. Now He provides a city. He provides a town. He's providing how to worship. He's providing food. He's doing all these things for them. And now He's going to talk about the laws and the holiness that He is. And it's again, as Moses is writing this down, he's writing this so that the Israelites that will be going into the land with Joshua, basically when he hands the book to Joshua, says, here's the manual on how to lead and how to do things. The book of Leviticus is about the holiness of God. Why do we do this, and how do we worship, and the importance of that. So we get atonement. We get the big word atonement, meaning that God understands that we're going to sin, and so He provides a way out. He says, you're going to sin, you're going to mess up, so this is how you get out of this. So it picks up at Sinai, so we're at the base of Mount Sinai when God establishes His covenant with Israel. So for 2 years, they stayed at the base of Sinai, and they wandered in the desert for 38 years. So this is the kind of the beginnings of the wandering. It hasn't happened yet, but they're getting close to it. Holiness of God. It's the ground rules. It's just here's how this works. This is how this is going to go. And God desires, and this is why I hit this all the time, God desires for His people to be separate. And this is such an important time for us to remember that. That's not just for Israel. This is for God's people. That we are called to be different, and we are called to be separate. And when the world says go this way, we say, God, what do you tell us? And that's the way we go. And it's very difficult. The world has done a great job of making us think we can be part of that. But this is a wonderful book that says, let's separate. And honestly, with that, as far as separation, that may be one of our biggest sins and or struggles, if not the biggest, is this separation. Truly being able to separate. Because if you you know, if you truly live the way Christ, you know, and we can break this down, but you know, all the discipleship books and things like this, you know, when Christ says to follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, I mean, that statement is packed with, you are to not look at this world, and you are to follow Jesus Christ. And as we've been studying in Mark, how the disciples went with just a rod, and they closed on their backs. And you know, it goes back to this whole statement, Leviticus 19. It's a powerful chapter. But he truly wants us to be separate from the world. And with that separation, you can take it the wrong way too. Hence people like Jim Jones, right? You know, he really separated them from the world. So don't take it that far. We're not going to go like start a commune anywhere, so don't worry about that. But chapter 19 of Leviticus really gives us the feel and the purpose for what's going on. The book of Leviticus really focuses on the Levites, the Levitical code, on how the priests are to work. Because if the priests work correctly, then they will be able to take the correct method to the towns and to the cities in which they're told to go. Hence, that's why Aaron, there was kind of no favorites, right? When Aaron's sons messed up, God was like, no, that was that. So it's really important on this, how this is. Which is the irony in that, isn't it? That when you think about the New Testament, by the time Jesus rolls around, the priests, the leaders of the church, how they have gone almost full circle, and that it's gone in the wrong direction. So they've accepted the role at Sinai. Israel became God's vassal nation. They are to have this. Remember, they're going into the world, and sometimes we forget they're not the only people. You know, there's the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, and all these ites that are floating around there, and they're going to be planted in there. Just as Christians are planted in different sections of the world, they've got to stand out. So that's why the laws were put in here so specifically. You know, sacrifice on this side and do this on this side. Speak a different way, write a different way. Monotheism, that there's only one God. There's not multiple gods. And when everybody saw them, they're going to look and think that they're different. So, but it's not so much about where to worship, but how to worship. And that's kind of the kicker with this. We find the 48 Levitical cities where priests are going to live. They were in the temple, the main temple, only 2 weeks out of the year. They spent the other 50 weeks teaching these first 5 books. Well, they're teaching the law, the Torah is the law. So they're teaching what it means to be holy, to give instruction, so forth and so on. So Moses was still kind of the main prophet. They would meet with him for 2 weeks out of the year. They'd get fired up, ready to go, and they'd have praise bands in and whatnot. And they get ready, and then they go back out and they do their thing. So the last little chart here on Leviticus, and then we're all going to be Old Testament scholars and ready to go, is the people. Obviously Moses, the Levites, the people of Israel. This is kind of our main group of people. The places we get are at the base of Mount Sinai. Remember, they're camped there for 2 years, and then they start the wandering process. In the events, we get descriptions of offerings. What do offerings look like? And this is not just monetary offerings, but these are sin offerings and guilt offerings and all those types. Duties, ordinations of priests, what does that look like? And the dietary laws, the big one that comes into play. And again, we see all of those in the New Testament. We know that Peter struggles with the dietary laws at times, and God had to intervene on him to tell him about that. So there we are. We did it. I don't know. There's not a clock in here. I don't know if we made it in an hour or not. So it was light when we came in. Is it dark yet? So still light. So we did good, didn't we? But that's just a little bit of an overview. Next week we're going to pick up at Leviticus 19, and we'll press on through that, and probably be able to get through most of Leviticus next week, and then we'll get through Numbers, and then Deuteronomy will probably be the one that we'll spend a little more time on. But and then after that, when it gets a little closer, I've got our sheets that I'll kind of hand out to you guys, and really kind of see what you would like to do next on Wednesday nights. Like I said, Sunday nights I've kind of got planned out, but Wednesday nights we've got a lot of options, and we can kind of go that route. So, any thoughts, questions, comments, critiques? Anything? Everybody good? Good to see you tonight. It's good to see everybody tonight, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's kind of like Brad said, I think it's going to be a slow process. But continue to encourage, continue to pray. I know this is a nervous time. Unfortunately, Jessica and I were talking about this morning. You're hearing of these little pop-ups. These little, pop up here in Texas, or pop up here in Florida, or pop up here. And I think, as people monitor the news so closely, it just incites that lock myself back in mode. We're gonna continue to be cautious ourselves, but can't really speak what I feel like I need to say, but anyway, we'll be cautious the way we need to be cautious, but I don't think we need to be so cautious that we are abandoning the one thing, and that is our Savior that can save us and heal us.
Amen.
I think we have to continue to move forward the best way that we can. So that's just going to come with prayer. It's going to come with encouragement of others, but we're going to keep marching forward. And God will direct, and I'm excited about what He has in store. I'm excited about meeting with our leadership group on a Sunday and getting things back together. So.